Welcome to Whitewater Leadership. My name is George Hutchinson and I'm Chief Exec and founder of River EFRA. River EFRA is a crisis and reputational risk advisory firm, and I've spent the best part of the last 30 years advising business leaders and leaders of organisations and charities when they're facing into major risks and systemic threats and crises. And yet when I think about organisations today, particularly in the public sector, in charities and in the third sector, they are facing an acute crisis. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Polly Neate. Polly.
Thanks, George. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the podcast. I'm Polly Neate. I'm an expert advisor for River EFRA, and I also convene the Social Insights panel for the Future Governance Forum. I'm really excited to be co-hosting this series of podcasts which look at what I think are some of the most significant challenges facing leaders in any sector, as George said. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the wisdom of some of the most well-respected leaders in the charity sector. As a former chief executive myself of Shelter and Women's Aid, I've definitely had my share of some whitewater experiences in my time.
Our guest for this episode is Mike Adamson. Mike is an honorary visiting professor at Bayes Business School. He's also an expert in systems change and is the former chief executive of the British Red Cross. Mike, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Just to kind of, I guess, open the discussion today, thinking about the acute risk that the third sector and the public sector are kind of facing as they have more demands, less money, and the challenges on leadership. In the management of risk in those spaces, if you are a leader of one of those organisations, what does it take to be good?
Well, there are all the things that you have to do that are kind of formulaic and procedural. Yeah, the board expects you to have a risk register, and you've got to make those things real, not just procedural and performative. But what I've learned over the years, both as chief executive of the Red Cross and in what I do now as chair of St Mungos, and indeed in the leadership coaching I do, listening to accompanying other leaders, is that a lot of this is about individual leadership and your authenticity, your values, your identity, and knowing who you are, because that is the wellspring that you reach into when actually, stuff happens and risks materialize. And also it's the wellspring that you're reaching into as you look ahead. And so what I've found is various things, both external shocks like the murder of George Floyd or the Ukraine crisis or Gaza, that you reach into yourself and think about who you are, and then you adopt a growth mindset as you actually think about how to handle that. And I think that's also the way in which to try to manage the inevitable dissonance that can arise between what's happening, what you might like to be able to say about something and what you can say about it. You've got to know who you are in order to be able to handle that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually that really neatly leads into something that we want to focus on a bit in this episode, if we may, Mike, which is internal activism within organisations and the kind of balance, I suppose, between wanting your people to be empowered and wanting their voices to be heard, but also needing to maintain a cohesive staff group. And that is a real challenge for a leader and a significant risk. And I wanted you to just talk a bit about the management of that and what you've learnt.
And I think actually across all sectors, but perhaps differently, that a much more socially and politically aware workforce that is picking up messaging for good and bad sometimes from social media about what they see, and wanting to feel part of an entity and an organization that is on the right side of history sometimes. And that can be, that can certainly be challenging and stretching, but the question is how do you make that align strategically, and also do it with a growth mindset. So I always remember the murder of George Floyd as a kind of a seminal moment in my leadership journey, as well as in the stories we tell in society and so on. And what I found difficult, I found a number of things difficult in those moments. One was trying to gauge what had actually happened. because was it the tragic death of a black man on the streets, or was it immediately, clearly a racist police murder? And actually trying to therefore gauge what the right approach and nuance of the messaging would be. But then 2 or 3 days afterwards, having a Zoom call, which had 700 people on it, which had been already scheduled around our inclusion and diversity policy, but suddenly we had 700 people on a Zoom call. And I was being asked questions about using language that I hadn't used before, like anti-racism, like privilege, like allyship. And that was not language that I had been using before. And I felt feeling out of my depth, but trying to adopt, to be very humble in that and listen, and being very fortunate to be accompanied by a number of youngish black female leaders at who are at middle levels of our organisation, and some of whom were actually quite active in things like Charity So White, in fact, who were prepared to, I suppose, trust enough to accompany and stretch. And so I think I count myself incredibly fortunate. So I felt very exposed, and then got language wrong, and we could talk about some times when that happened. But actually, I never doubted that I was growing as a leader, and that we were growing as an organisation in understanding what an inclusive policy, an inclusive approach might mean, and why that was so important to us strategically if we were going to be the organisation as the Red Cross, which is founded on humanity, impartiality, neutrality, that we needed to be. And so it was really exposing and stretching, but also a process of growing.
Yeah. And did you have different groups of staff who were reacting to that situation in different ways that didn't always sit easily alongside each other? Or did you have a kind of fairly united? I suppose what I'm thinking about is where you've got major external situations happening, people within organisations actually feel differently about those events, and you've then got to manage the risks that creates internally.
Yeah, I think, obviously, some of your experience, Paul, is with an organisation like Shelter, which has got, decades of campaigning roots, and therefore a very politicised workforce to some extent. I'm sure we'll end up talking about that. The Red Cross is different. We have some people like that who've I said all of the people, staff and volunteers, are inspired by the cause. What is it trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? But some of them are not politicised. They're everyday people wanting to make a difference, volunteering in shops, volunteering, supporting somebody coming out of hospital. They're not on the front lines of political debate. They just want to help people. And there's some of the language that we're then developing and using is potentially alienating to them. And actually, that is a real challenge. And then sometimes, and this happened, I think, a little bit to the Red Cross after that, the inclusion, also sometimes the time I was there, the inclusion and diversity team language was getting ahead of where I was, and let alone where the organisation was in terms of its ability to absorb it. And in fact, the risk being that the language is moving, if the language moves too far ahead, then actually you're not taking people with you on something that I had pretty quickly concluded was so important for us to actually be who we needed to be and who I wanted to be as a leader.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, you said something there that I think is really interesting as well, which is about the cause. And it's sort of, how do you, when there are such big events within society that matter so much to your own people, how do you manage staying on cause when actually there are big societal issues sitting there? You've got an activist workforce who absolutely understand how to campaign, or in the policy teams, but you've got other people who are there so focused on delivery, and balancing those needs becomes really difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you tell, well, it's about how you tell the story, isn't it? So, I mean, this may sound relatively minor, but at the time it was significant. Coming out of all of that, there was really, really good stuff. And actually because we weren't talking enough to the diversity groups within the organisation, I have to own that, I wasn't talking enough to them. And actually, we revitalised our diversity groups. They did exist, but we revitalised them. We made, the chief executive and executive team available and engaging with them. But that led to conversations way beyond race, because we started to talk about menopause and periods, and I got some of the language wrong, and that was fed back to me, but in a very helpful way, where again we could grow, and so that worked well. Where I think then another aspect where it starts to get difficult is obviously on trans issues, where again what is the right stance, or on things like Ukraine and Gaza. Organisations, so at St Mungos, we made statements on Ukraine, but we didn't make statements on Gaza. And trying to judge when you are making a statement and why, and what are the principles you're applying in determining that. I was actually talking to my daughter. I won't say where she works, but she said that they made a statement on Ukraine and not Gaza as well. But actually, they then said the explanation for not making a statement on Gaza was that the organisation is geopolitically neutral. But then why did they make the statement on Ukraine? And how do we, I don't know about you, but I wake up railing against the radio when I wake up in the mornings these days, not just because of what is happening, but because the inability of any interest group or community that is suffering to express empathy for the other. And it's just tragic. So if we're going to express empathy and make statements about Gaza, is it about bearing witness? Is it bearing witness to the cause and actually what the injustice? Is it about the fact that some of our staff are Palestinian and therefore we want them to know that we care? But we have staff who are Jewish as well, who have just suffered a grievous harm, but with which we must express empathy and for for their feeling, and how we judge these things. But there's so few leaders are expressing empathy for the other side, or people who may be perceived as the other side.
Yeah. And there's a difference between, it all can create risky situations. And I do want to look at this through the lens of risk, but it's different what you might talk about internally, isn't it? And what you might talk about externally. I'm thinking about Ukraine and Gaza. So I definitely was criticised for this, for sure. But we made a statement about Ukraine at Shelter because it was about Ukrainians in this country becoming homeless. And we've done the same about Syrian refugees in this country becoming homeless. So we didn't make public statement I'm talking about the conflict that's happening now, because at the moment, or certainly at the time I was at Shelter, it wasn't creating a homelessness situation in the UK, and that's what our job is. So you can draw those distinctions, but that doesn't mean that you escape the risk that conflict creates for your organisation, does it?
Absolutely not, because people are not people. Well, we all do it, don't we? We filter what we hear with our prejudgments about a situation and indeed the person who is giving the message. So even whatever is expressed in as balanced a way as possible may not be heard in that light. And then we're often also criticised because we're not saying it fast enough. The number of times we made a statement, but actually we took more days than it. I don't know whether it took more days than it should have done, but for some people, it definitely took more days than they felt it should.
Yeah.
And you're carrying, and then you've also got staff who are observing what is happening in other organisations. So there's a constant comparison of how other leaders and chief executives are handling situations, and then sometimes handle in the context of, both Shelter and St Mungos experienced strikes, for example, about which were framed often in the context of a wider economic injustice and other strikes that were taking place in other organisations, and then it became a platform from which to comment on those, which created significant risk, for example, for St Mungos, because there were pickets outside St Mungos, there were pickets outside the offices of trustees, and they were being asked to carry significant risk and articulate then back into some very prestigious organisations why there were pickets outside because of their volunteering activity in this nice homelessness charity.
Yeah.
Creating real risk, reputational risk for them as well. So there's a knock-on effect.
And I think that takes me back to, again, you used the word there, the why word. The why do we engage here and don't we engage there? And why is it right to have the pay structures we have within the, being really clear about your mission all the way through to then how it is delivered and sits there, and facing into some of those risks as transparently as possible? Because I think sometimes in organisations that are mission-led, where actually what you do is so good, you don't necessarily always want to have the harder conversations. Is that fair?
Well, I think that is why you have to, going back to where I started about handling risk, there's something about knowing, understanding as best you can both your individual identity and what your values are, as well as the organisation's identity and values. They may not be set in stone, because I would argue that both for me and the organisation, the murder of George Floyd actually led to a change in how we understood those and expressed those. But I think if you do have access to, I think what I referred to earlier is that wellspring, you can speak more authentically. You're not just trying to put up statements that are tacking with the wind. You're trying to be who you need to be while you manage risk, and help the organisation understand an external situation.
And in a world that I guess is more polarised and less forgiving, that's a difficult thing to do at best, isn't it?
Yeah, no, really difficult. And when and also it all depends whether it's a quiet news day or not. And I think I remember making comments. This is less about internal activism, but I remember making comments externally saying that the NHS was facing a humanitarian crisis. It was a quiet news day. The whole world exploded for several days. My comments were called irresponsible and overblown by the Prime Minister, in Prime Minister's Question Time, because it was a gift to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
So actually the statements you make carry risk externally, and a lot depends on how they're interpreted. We weren't particularly seeking a row. We were seeking to bear witness to what we saw. And similarly, if we talk about Gaza, as the Red Cross talking about Gaza, it bears witness to what it sees. But some of the celebrity supporters that the Red Cross had from the Jewish community took great exception to that and said that we were not being neutral, and that we had not borne witness to the attack by Hamas that led to thousands of people dying in Israel. And so, but we were able to show that actually we had borne witness on both sides of that story, but actually they didn't hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you do anything differently now with hindsight? Because stepping back from an organisation, I've done it myself. You do get a lot of hindsight and a lot of opportunity to reflect. And this, for me, this is one of the topics I've reflected on most. Is it the same for you? And what are your reflections?
I think I think that if I had my time again, it would be about pace rather than where we actually got to in the end.
Right.
I think that I'm not a natural campaigner. I'm about. I'm going to use the phrase about constancy of purpose.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean fixed strategy, but it does mean a constancy of purpose.
Yeah.
I'm not just chasing a headline and a campaign and so on. We did use campaign techniques, and actually, therefore, I think that may have meant that at times I was a bit slow to react on things like George Floyd or So I think it's the pace at which we would handle things. I mean, there were other incidents that happened, like the safeguarding crisis in international aid that became known as the Oxfam crisis. But of course, there, for the grace of God, go all the other organisations as well, because whatever the media handling, it was a crisis in the international aid industry. It wasn't just a crisis of Oxfam, and the Red Cross was as much affected by that as any. And I think again, in terms of handling that risk, it was about being on the front foot fast in the public domain with what our position was. We were doing a lot internally, in fact, that we could demonstrate to people internally, but I don't think we did enough externally quick enough, looking back, to be on the front foot. So I think I would come back to pace. And then there were specific mistakes I made that people then raised, but we operated with humility, though, I think, and tried to correct them.
So making mistakes, but it was okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to jump in because I know George is going to interrupt me, so I'm like not looking at him. So, because I just want to ask you something. So you are a real expert on systems leadership and partnership and collaboration. And I just want to ask you, a lot of what we've been talking about with internal activism is, I think anyway, relates to a very polarized public discourse. A lot of disinformation around, a lot of you've got to pick a side on all kinds of issues. It's not okay to just not know. You've got to know and you've got to pick a side. What impact does that have on systems, the ability to practice systems leadership, particularly, where you've got, as I say, like a lot of misinformation, a lot of polarization? Systems leadership and collaboration, which is what you, Mike, are all about, isn't it? Does it make it more difficult? What's the impact of that?
People mean so many different things by system and collaborative leadership. And there is no doubt that the toxicity of debate makes it harder to bring about change on the big issues of the day. Because there is so much misinformation about all of the issues we talked about trans issues, about inclusion issues, about climate issues, that actually, if we want to address them, then taking people forwards in a systemic way is hard. But and on migration, critically as well, just massive disinformation.
Kind of the main thing I was referring to, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And poisonous, toxic debate. I think, though, that a lot of system and collaborative leadership doesn't take place in the public eye. And actually, part of the way in which that happens is through curiosity and humility, where people from different parts of an ecosystem, often the leaders, because they have to make the first move, come together with humility and curiosity to say, actually, if our vision is about an inclusive, tolerant society in which refugees and asylum seekers can find safe haven, then actually we need to work differently together. And at the moment, we're not. And it is the willingness to actually to properly embrace that and say, how would it have to change if we were to work differently on that together? Now, at that point, the whole toxicity of the external debate is merely the backdrop to that. And I would argue that in on too many of the big societal and social issues of the day, be it homelessness, to be frank, be it climate, be it refugees and asylum seekers, actually, if you properly held the mirror up to the social purpose sector, and particularly the charity sector, we're simply not working well enough on those big issues together, and that's on leaders. Long before, they may blame the toxicity of the external debate, or they may say, but I've got to raise my money through my brand. But actually, you have a choice about how you use your time and whether you are prepared to put your shoulder to the wheel of a collective vision that transcends the individual organisational purpose, and then, fair deal for refugees and asylum seekers, re-engineer your organisation's role within that ecosystem in order to be more complementary to others, so that overall would bring about bigger change.
So, Mike, within that space, because I think that's absolutely right, one of the things that I have observed over the past kind of 30 years working alongside different leaders in the third sector, the public sector, and in the private sector, but if I take it really into the charitable sector, there are two challenges that I think sit there, and I'm going to frame them in biases. One of the biases that I see very often is persecution bias. Do you know how hard it is, how hard the outside world is, how polarized it is? Why are we being attacked for these things? Because in this polarized world, everybody is attacking everybody else. And that creates a behavior of where you kind of close your mind a bit. And then alongside that, the other one is kind of crusade bias. What we do is so important. We are so worthy that again, we slightly close our minds so that we don't necessarily get to ask the big system question. We end up just fighting the tactical battles and feeling so, in a way, justified, and maybe rightly so, and fairly so, but that we're actually not looking at the real problem that sits there.
And I think there's a third one as well, George, which is actually, if I take my eye off the ball that's in front of me, my organisation will go under because the business model is under such pressure, and I'll end up making lots of people redundant, and there's no way I want that to be my legacy. So you've got a whole range of things going on. But the question is, who are we as leaders? And comes back to that point of what are we here for? What is our purpose? And how will we use our time and resources? And how will we look after ourselves? How will we look after our people? With whom will we form common purpose? And so clearly there are times when all of us will feel overwhelmed. And certainly there were times when I was leading where I felt overwhelmed and actually struggling to keep your head above water, either because the water had risen or because I was just knackered and I couldn't swim hard enough. But the idea I was on a balcony was I was a long way off a balcony. And we have to ask, well, in what way is the wider system helping or hindering that?
Yeah.
So, the risk is, and we've talked historically about, we want to move away from models of heroic leadership. But in one way, we're actually also asking leaders to be heroic right now in order to cope with all of that and raise their head above the parapet and actually orchestrate within a system. And you have to ask, that our boards don't necessarily ask us about that. The Charity Commission doesn't nudge us in that way. It just asks us to fill in financial statements in a certain way. Our leadership development, the investment in leadership development is typically not in that kind of systemic leadership, and therefore peer group support that you can get because others are in the same situation. You can get peer group support of, I feel overwhelmed and God isn't this miserable, let's have a drink. But actually, what are we collectively going to do about that? And is the leadership development that we're investing in collectively creating a movement of people who expect to work in this way, so that actually it becomes a responsibility to collaborate, and it's not okay not to collaborate, and you can hold the mirror up to fellow leaders who are not collaborating. It's okay to do that. At the moment, I don't think that would be the case, because it would all be about empathy with the fact it's so
They're
difficult.
all having such a hard time.
With persecution or crusade or just the business model is falling apart. But I don't think that's good enough, and surely movements begin with people choosing for it to be different, and then working out, what is the impact.
One of the things we now know, I've got a team of world-leading performance psychologists, is that pressure on the individual. So anyone under enough pressure, their performance will start to decline. We might all be quite good under a certain amount of pressure, but actually when it really kicks in, what pressure generally does, though, is overplays your strength. So actually, sometimes a bit of hero is good, but too much hero becomes the problem. And actually just understanding that in yourself as a leader can be really helpful as to what are my strengths, and do I, when I'm in a real pressure situation, and I don't know whether you've experienced this, actually gone, maybe I did overplay, maybe I took too much control, or I actually walked away from control in those spaces.
Well, definitely. Yeah, because we've all got egos. And I love being at the centre of the system and people coming to me to ask me what I think and and so on, playing my part and, pretending to be all humble and all the rest of it. It's kind of there. No, of course that's there, but you use the key phrase is self-awareness, isn't it? About what is going on there and about alignment of its ego with the wider purpose, and knowing when you're going under a bit, and because it's not, I think leadership is an inside-out process as well, isn't it? And this affects the whole of your life, because when you're carrying the responsibilities at the top of an organization, you're living with it 24/7. You wake up to it. You wake up in the middle of the night to it, and you get back to sleep. You carry it all the time, and that is an enormous privilege, because we've been privileged, Polly, haven't we, to lead organizations where we so believe in it and what we're trying to do. We never wake up in the morning and question, are we trying to do the right thing? We may question, have we done the right thing, and are we doing the right thing? Yeah. But we're not questioning the why of what we're trying to do. And so we definitely sometimes, that ego side overplays. And I remember when we set up a new collaboration that really came out, the roots were in the Grenfell Tower fire, around building societal resilience. I'm 10 years on, I'm glad to say it's still enduring. 250 organizations, small and large, working together to contribute to national resilience and create a connective system. But there are times when, the Red Cross was, we overplayed it, and we got criticized by small organizations that didn't trust us. But again, you step back and say, we did get that wrong, and you've just got to be constantly open to that. And also how you show your own vulnerability as a leader. I remember in the first leadership conference with about 100 people after COVID, and we were bringing people back together. We wanted it to be developmental in nature, so we had sessions on everything about how we lead and so on. And within that was about how we manage mental health as an issue and stress as an issue in the organization. And it was a very powerful session, and we were talking about trauma-informed practice and all of this kind of stuff, which was, again, new language to me that I didn't feel totally comfortable with. But I came out of that session realizing that I couldn't just come and do my normal valedictory end of conference thing, go back out there and save the world, because I felt really crap. I felt exhausted. I had a cough that wouldn't leave. I just couldn't get rid of it. The 2 years in a row I'd gone to the Christmas party, and I just didn't want to be there because I had to be warm and funny, and I just couldn't. It was so stressful, because all I wanted to do, I could function during the day and do what I needed to do, but I couldn't. I then had to also be, show all this bonhomie, and I felt tremendous warmth to those people. But I felt I had to go, and the end of this conference, I needed to go. It would not be authentic not to acknowledge that. And there we were talking about mental health. So that's what I talked about in my end of conference speech. How my feelings of vulnerability, the Christmas party, feeling overwhelmed, all of that stuff, the cough that wouldn't leave. And actually, I wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. I was just being authentic. And actually the response, of course, is incredible, because they're all carrying that as well in different ways, and actually gave them permission to be vulnerable. And so how we handle these situations of pressure, but equally, you can't do it all the time, because people want to know that the person in charge has got a plan and has got and can cope, and can handle this, and because that also gives them confidence, and that actually we've got to, we're going to be okay. But showing that you're feeling some of these things is also very important.
And I think, Mike, that's a really great point to kind of end this session, and just thinking about that ultimately the leader ends up being a human being, and for good and ill, and to be the leader, but also sometimes to show a little bit of vulnerability without showing so much weakness that you might lose your crowd on the way. And I think, that's a really difficult challenge, particularly for the sector that you are in.
That was great, Mike. Thank you so much. And I could listen to you talking about your collaborative leadership all day. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
If you're listening and you thought that this was an interesting discussion, Please do share on your socials and engage with us at #WhitewaterLeadership. Thank you for joining us, and Polly.
Yeah, thank you from me as well. And do follow me and River Effra on LinkedIn to get news of all podcast episodes as they drop.